Welcome back to House Spoon. If you want to see how I make these pie cuts and turn them into a dump pipe for my GE Patrol, then sit down, buckle up, because we're about to get into it. Now, where should we start? I guess the best place to start with is, what the hell is a pie cut? And for those pie lovers of you, no, it is not a slice of pie. It's actually working with metal. Surprise, surprise. So, it's basically getting a straight length of tube, cutting it on angles, so that you can then make a bend out of it. If you're finding it a bit hard to visualize what that actually looks like, bear with me. Here's one I prepared earlier. So this is basically what I use just as a bit of a jig for some of the lobster backs that I do. And as you can see, it's just a whole pile of individual pieces that are tacked together. And obviously they're just cut on certain angles with certain distances to make a bend. Another name for pie cuts is also lobster back, which, as you can imagine, that roughly looks like a lobster back, hence the name, but you can feel free to call it whatever you like. Now, why would you actually spend the time and all the effort and the money in getting something lobster backed or pie cut? Well, let me give you an example. So the dump pipe that I need to make for the Patrol at the moment, I originally bought this, just a standard mandrel 3-inch tube bent at 90, and I was planning on using this as the dump pipe. However, there isn't actually enough room to fit this bend in before the firewall. So to solve that issue, you've got to go with a pie cut. And the good thing about a pie cut is that you can get pretty much whatever radius you want on the inside of the tube, as well as if you're doing some fancy pipe work or anything like that, you can actually clock these or rotate these pieces individually, and you don't have to go in a straight line. You can basically go in whatever direction you want, making some fancy Instagram-worthy lobster back work. Hopefully that explains why you'd want to actually use pie cutting for fabrication. If it doesn't, drop a comment below and I'll try and answer that for you. Now I'm going to head off to some paper and pen and try and explain to you how to actually make these pie cuts. All right, it's time to get mathematical. Now, I don't have a fancy whiteboard, but we do have an old school chalkboard, so we'll roll with that. Now, the first question that we need to answer is, how many individual pie cuts do we need for a bend? Now, this is completely up to you. So in this example, I'm going to be using a 90-degree bend because it's the easiest way to calculate things. Now, you can have as little as 2 pie cut pieces to do a 90-degree bend, but instead of it being a nice radius like that, it'll end up looking like this with very square edges. Now, square corners generally aren't a very good idea to have for airflow. So instead of having a square corner like this, we really want to try and get a nice radius like this one over here. On the other side of the pie, we could have like 20 individual pie cuts, and that would make a really gradual radius, because you would have lots of small intersections like that. Excuse the poor drawing, I'm obviously not an artist. The downside to using a heap of individual pie cuts is that it's just very time consuming. So you've got the actual time of the cutting of them, you've got the time of the welding, the prep work, everything. So you need to generally find a happy medium between the two. Now, however many individual pie cuts you plan on using, you have to make sure that they evenly divide into 90 degrees. So for example, we have this piece here. We have a 45-degree cut times 2, because there's 2 pieces, that equals 90 degrees. Now for this piece here, if we use 9 pieces, 9 divides evenly into 90 degrees. So that'll be 10 degrees for each piece. To try and make that make a little bit more sense, I thought I'd try and write it on the board. So we've got our 90-degree bend, which is what we want to achieve, divided by 9 individual pieces, like that, equals 10 degrees. So that's 10 degrees between each piece. Now, to make things a little bit more complicated, we've then got our 10 degrees, but then we need to divide it by 2, because you're actually doing 2 cuts for each pie cut. So each pie cut that you need to do is actually 5 degrees. Another way of looking at it is this equation here. Now, our final cut angle, which is what we want to achieve, will equal the bend angle, which is 90 degrees, divided by bracket 2 times n. Now n is the number of pie cuts that we've got, so that is 9. Now if you punch that into a calculator, you'll end up with the same 5 degrees. Alright, now that we've got our bend angle, we can now work out the length of each pie cut. So this is the formula up here. Now this formula is applicable all the time when you're doing pie cuts, so you can save this and use it at a later date. So L is for the length of the pie cut. That's what we want to find out. Then you start entering all this, so open bracket, 2 times our center line radius. So this is the center line radius that we want to achieve. So for this example, we're just going to say we want to achieve a 3-inch center line radius. So we enter that, close bracket, plus D. Now D is the diameter of the tube that we're actually using. So in this case, we'll say we're using 4-inch tube, close bracket, times, open bracket, sine, whatever the hell that scientific sine crap is, just punch it in on your scientific calculator online, or if you've got one in your hand. Open bracket, angle. Now this angle is 5 degrees, because that's the angle that we found down here. Now, once you punch all of that into your calculator, it'll calculate it out to 0.87 inches. And now the reason that that's in inches is because we entered inches here. So if we translate that to freedom units, we get 22 millimeters. Now you can actually put metric numbers in here if you want. So instead of 3 inches, 76 mil, or whatever it happens to work out to, and that'll give you the metric version straight away. Now that we've got these two numbers, our 22 millimeters and our 5 degrees, that's literally all the information that we need. So we've got our 5 degrees on our cuts, so that's what we set our bandsaw to cut at. And then we've got our 22 millimeters, which is the long side of our cut, which is the outside of the radius. Now I know this may seem pretty complex. I was pretty confused to start with because I'm not the smartest person around. But if you just follow the steps, it's quite simple. So to recap, all you need to know is this formula here, do that one first, then this formula here, and do that one second. That'll give you the two numbers, the only two numbers that you need to know for doing your pie cuts. Now it's back off to you, Bronson number 1. Thanks for that, Bronson number 2. Now, before we can start getting into the cutting of the tube, we need to draw two opposing lines on the end of the tube. Now, the reason that we need to do that is because we need to rotate the tubing 180 degrees in the saw, or however you choose to do your cuts, so that you can end up with your actual pie cuts. Now, there's a few different ways that you can actually mark two opposing lines on a round tube. The method that I use is I've got this set of squares here. So you've got a few different attachments. You've got your normal square, you've got your angle square, and then there's also this attachment, which is perfect for doing round tube. And basically that gives you the center of the tube, which is very handy. So then you just get your texter, mark your line on the top and the bottom, and it's as simple as that, really. Now that we've got our marks on the end of the tube, the next thing we need to do is extend those lines for the length of the tube. So the easiest way to do that, I've found, get a bit of scrap angle line or similar. You can rest that along the length of the tube like so, line it up with your line, and then simply put your line all the way across. And then obviously it's the same for the other side. Now that I've got those lines all marked out, we'll head on over to the bandsaw. Excuse the dirty bandsaw, it's a bit dirty, I know, I need to clean it. Now, here's a handy little tip, which is quite easy to remember. So, I'm using 3-inch tubing. Now, to find the center of that in the bandsaw, you just put your ruler up against your vise, mark your halfway point, which in my case is 1.5 inches. Obviously, if you're doing 4-inch tube, you'd mark 2 inches. and that just gives you your halfway point to line up your tube against when you're actually doing your cuts. Because when you do your cuts, you end up rotating the tube 180 degrees for each cut. So this just gives a great point to line on your tube up with. You now need to adjust the bandsaw angle to your desired cut angle, which in my case is 7.5 degrees. Now it's time to rotate the tube so that we can perform the other side of our pie cut. And as you can see by all of these lines, by having all of them, it's easy just to line them up and makes life a hell of a lot easier. Now, if you're doing a lot of these pie cuts, it pays to have a stopper that you can bring up and use against the end of the tube here. But I don't do a lot of repetitive cuts like this, so the way that you can do it if you don't have a stopper is basically just put your ruler up against the edge of the blade along the back or the longest section of the tube, and that'll give you a pretty accurate distance for how long the outside of the cut is going to be. As you can see, we've got our 6 pie cuts here. Now it's just as simple as lining the 2 texture marks up like so. And by the time we end up joining all 6 pieces together, we'll end up with a 90-degree straight bend. Now, to try and illustrate what I was talking about earlier, if you simply clock these pieces so that the texture marks are not aligned, and we'll continue doing that with the 3rd piece. Trying for the 4th piece in my hand, if I can. For the 6th piece, or 5th piece I should say. Now, hopefully you can see that, but you can see how that's basically now a spiral rather than just a straight bend, which obviously would be pretty useful for some tight situations on automotive things as well as anything else you can pretty much imagine. As you'll see, I've burnt through the inside of the pie cuts. This can be quite easy to do when you have such a small amount of material that you're welding. Well, the pie cuts are all welded up. I fixed the hole that I blew initially, so that's all good to go now. And yes, I know the welds don't look anything fancy, but that's what you got to expect when you're working with probably the lowest quality material that you can find, i.e. mild steel. But the main thing is that the welds are nice and strong and there's lots of pano. So happy days. Now, next thing I need to do is weld the V-band onto the dump pipe, which goes to the turbo. I then need to weld a little EGT bung into it. So obviously drill the hole, weld that in. So I've got my EGT probe that can go into there. And then obviously I'll need to extend this down a little bit further and then weld another V-band on to go onto the rest of my exhaust. So we'll get into that right now. Well, I think I'll call it a wrap there. I'll now whack this into the Patrol and be one step closer to being done. So to address the most common comment that I'm probably going to get in this comment section, why did I make this out of mild steel instead of stainless? And the reason for that is basically the rest of the exhaust is already mild steel, and it's been on the car for 10 years since I've owned it, who knows how long before me, and it's still in pretty good condition. So I really don't see any reason that it can't last another 10 years. Now I could go and make the dump pipe, the rest of the exhaust all out of nice shiny stainless steel, but it's just a lot of money for what I don't see really being an issue. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Also, you've got the big question mark around how durable stainless steel is on a four-wheel drive that actually gets properly used as a four-wheel drive, not just a pavement queen. Stainless steel is generally also more prone to cracking than mild steel, so that's just another thing that I took into my consideration when I was considering what material to use for this. And also, it's a four-wheel drive that goes in the bush, goes through bog holes, gets treated pretty harshly, so I honestly don't care about the look of a nice shiny stainless exhaust. I'm more than happy with just an exhaust that simply works and doesn't break the bank. I also just wanted to do a quick comparison. I know I showed this earlier, but now that the dump pipe's now finished, hopefully that picks up on camera, but you can see a big difference between the radius on a normal mandrel bend and the lobster back bend. And obviously that suits the tighter spacing of the engine bay much better. With all that being said, I really hope that this video has simplified the process of making these pie cuts. If there's any questions that you've got that I haven't covered in this video, just be sure to drop a comment below in the comment section. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to check out more of my fabrication videos and a few more videos I've got coming up in the future, be sure to hit that subscribe button and I'll catch you in the next one.